Welcome to the 13 Days of Halloween with me, your host, Eddie Spuhghetti. Leading up to Halloween, I'm going to be discussing my favorite picks for films, television shows, and TV specials, stuff that I love to watch around this time of year, and that I think you would be into as well. With that, let's get on to my pick for this video. Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, 1948, directed by Charles Barton, written by Robert Lees, Frederick I. Ronaldo, and John Grant. Starring everybody: Lugosi, Chaney, Abbott, Costello, Strange, etc. Those of you who know me very well know that this is my favorite film of all time. I'm just going to start off by saying that. So there's a lot of love going in for this one. And I can honestly watch it any time of year, but I especially love watching it around Halloween. That's for damn sure. So without spoiling too much, Abbott and Costello are both baggage clerks, and they happen to get a shipment that's for a horror wax museum, and it happens to be the remains of the Frankenstein monster and the original real Count Dracula. At the same time, Lawrence Talbot, aka the Wolfman, has now kind of became a monster hunter in a sense, and he's trying to trail those remains so he could finally destroy them. And they're not really remains. It's them. Now, this isn't the first multi-monster movie that Universal Studios put out. In fact, it's one of the later ones. They had already done House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula, where you got multiple monsters in one film. But this happens to have probably the best storyline of all of those. It's probably better paced as well, I find, if you were to go back and compare them all. This one, though, despite the fact that it has the comedic elements to it, it does a very good job of doing the serious kind of scenes very well and feeling in tone of the past films. If anything, you know, this is one of the better sequels to the original movies like Frankenstein, Dracula, and the Wolfman. It just so happens that it has this comedic element to it, which it doesn't ruin it, though. It feels really awesome. You could say that Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein is the granddaddy of horror comedies. So without this, you know, you wouldn't really have something that works like Evil Dead kind of dealio. You know, at the time when this came out, horror films were still a thing, and interjecting this into, especially, you know, the two of the biggest comedians at the time in the world into that type of film sounds kind of strange, but horror and comedy work really well together. We've seen lots of examples of this following this movie. Again, be it Evil Dead, you know, Waxwork, that sort of stuff. Horror comedies are very common. American Werewolf in London, by example, is technically a horror comedy. But there's always a line where they work very well together, and it depends on how well you're able to meld together the serious stuff with the funny stuff and the way that you treat it. And Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, again, is a great example of doing this. And if anything, it's really paved the way for those types of films. It's still very funny. Even though, like, I know all the jokes off by heart, I still laugh when they're delivered because it's just so well done. It's so, you know, it can be sarcastic, it can be goofy, but it all feels still very fresh. It just works very well in terms of the style of Abbott and Costello's kind of burlesque comedy style, and mixing with these monster movie kind of tones and stuff. It sounds very strange, but it all works really well together. And I find that it's still a very funny movie to this day. The impressive thing that this movie did as well is that it rejuvenated both Abbott and Costello's career, but also the monsters' careers, and it gave opportunities to new creatures, like the creature from the Black Lagoon. So without this one, if this one failed, probably wouldn't have been a creature film. It's kind of hard to say how things would have gone. I still adore this movie as much as I did when I was 3 or 4, watching it every single day. For like 2 years worth or something. I watched it every day. I literally would put it on every day. I would not get bored of it. I loved all the different elements of it. I loved the monsters, I loved the comedy, I loved the chase scenes, the atmosphere, the fucking castles, the creepiness of it. It was all great. And it felt very, you know, appropriate for someone of my age. I very much kind of like easily got into it and didn't find it too morbid or too scary or anything like that. It really gave me my love for Universal monster films, and I wanted to see more and more and more of that. If anything, I had no idea that this was kind of like the cap of those films. This was kind of like the send-off film for those characters. Now, for a while, I used to say that it was my favorite movie, and then I kind of changed that tone as I got older, partially because I think people kind of overall would kind of feel as if like the Universal films are a little boring and they're black and white. And it's unfortunate that that kind of stigma comes from folks who don't really know how wonderful these type of movies are. And that unfortunately, you know, black and white stuff is boring because, you know, it's paced slower and there's no special effects and that sort of stuff, which is bullshit. These are very wonderful movies. And if you have not checked out Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, I would say first off, probably give a gander at the original movies, see if you like those, and if you want to kind of see where things eventually left off and how they kind of put a cap on everything of those, Abbott and Costello is the way to go. Meeting Frankenstein. Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. What else can I say about this movie? I don't think very much. I can't even put into words how big of a deal this movie is to me and my career and how much it's influenced me in all kinds of different ways, whether it's comedy, you know, horror movies, my taste in horror, etc. It's done so much for me, and I can't even put into words like how much I appreciate it. But I do think that you should check it out, especially if you haven't seen any of the old Universal Monsters movies. This one, again, has a lot of them crammed together, but it does a very good job of showcasing each of them and giving them their own time and showing their strengths. And despite the fact that it's also a comedy, the funny stuff works really well with the horror. And when you got both those kind of genres going on together and it works really well, you're in for a good time. Well, that does it for this edition of the 13 Days of Halloween. I am your host, Eddie Spuhghetti. Thank you for joining me. And leading up to Halloween, we'll be discussing more of my favorite picks for films and TV shows and TV specials that I love to watch around this time of year. Until the next one, we'll do lunch.